All right, so this is my title slide. I'm going to be talking about how we use Nexus at National Cancer Institute, and I will I'm going to do some intros of National Cancer Institute, the environment there, myself. I want to talk about the Nexus Pro instances that we use at National Cancer Institute, how we use Nexus in our workflow, and I will include some talk about continuous integration there. I'm going to talk a little bit about the integration that we have with some of the other tools, the benefits we're seeing of using Nexus, and future plans and opportunities for using Nexus more and doing more improvements to our overall process and tooling. So National Cancer Institute, for those who don't know, that's a government agency. We are under Health and Human Services, under the National Institutes of Health. So our domains that we have that you can look at from the outside world are nci.nih.gov and cancer.gov are our main locations. So NCI manages, I'm sorry about the typo, a broad range of research, training, and information dissemination activities. So NCI helps researchers, helps train more researchers and scientists and clinicians, etc., and also provides information to the general public about, say, information about different cancers or how you might look to get routed into a clinical trial, etc. NCI is the largest funder of cancer research in the world. And I will be referring to CBIT several times during this talk. I am situated within CBIT. That's the Center for Biomedical Informatics and Information Technology. And we support all of NCI. So to explain a little bit about myself. First of all, I just want to make very clear, I am speaking as a practitioner. I am a contractor. I am not a direct employee of NCI. They like me to make that clear when I speak. So my employer is actually General Dynamics Information Technology. One of the things I wanted to mention was the description on the speaker page on SCED, for instance, says I was going to talk about how we're using it within GDIT. So my presentation actually is going to focus on our work specifically at National Cancer Institute. We just got acquired by General Dynamics Information Technology recently. I did give a presentation last week to my legacy General Dynamics Information Technology compatriots, and I am hoping to learn more about how they are doing continuous integration, build dependency management, etc. And maybe some of us will come back next year and talk about how other parts of our company do work. So I am on the Linux engineering team with CBIT infrastructure support. I've been supporting National Cancer Institute for 10 years. My title is config manager. I am an ITIL expert. I believe that ITIL and DevOps can be compatible. It depends on how you apply it. It's a framework for reference, common language, etc. So in my job here, I wear a lot of hats. I do application build and deploy automation. I do initial consultations with groups that want our infrastructure support, whether it means they need a server for a new website or they are down in the lab at National Institutes of Health and need network support, or they want to talk with us about storage options for large amounts of data, etc. I'm going on call again next week, and I also do some project management. So this talk is going to talk focus specifically on Nexus use here if you go back to my all-day DevOps presentation from October, I talk a lot more about how our overall work fits in with the process, how we do DevOps, our agile focus, et cetera, which talks about the processes, the teams we work with. This talk is going to be more technical. So, but you can go back and look if you're curious about kind of the larger picture and context for what we do. So the National Cancer Institute is very heterogeneous. So for the over 700 websites that we support, remember I talked about research and training and information dissemination. So we have static HTML, we have complex bioinformatics applications. These are on multiple tiers. It's thousands of servers. Some of these are legacy applications still hanging on. Some are thriving and under continual development. Some are brand new projects that we're piloting or working with. Our application layer and containers that we deal with may be HTML, Drupal, Tomcat, JBoss, Wildfly, Docker. We have some legacy stuff, and we have a few other things, but that's the majority of what we work with. Our servers are mostly, we have a lot of Linux servers and a lot of Windows servers. Most of our infrastructure is virtual machines. We do have some physical machines for situations where they absolutely need physical support for what they're doing. We have an on-premise data center. We are starting to do more and more with AWS. And the developers that we work with range from lone scientists to large teams with varying programming experience. So some of them need more infrastructure team support, some need less. So all this is just to say our whole process for dealing with build and deploy has to be flexible. So I'm going to talk about the, so we're using Nexus Pro repository manager at National Cancer Institute. And I'm going to talk some about the specific instances that we have at National Cancer Institute. We started with a 2x instance. I'll be talking about the 3x instances on the next slide, but that's the 2x is what we started with, the professional repository manager that is using the Maven format. So we have mostly binaries and some text files and so on there. On that instance, we are proxying the approved repository. So we have a process for checking about adding instances to be proxied as opposed to just willy-nilly adding every instance that could possibly be proxied. So that there's a process where we go through and evaluate that because we care about build resiliency for things that we may need to support years later. So we also host a lot of locally built and customized binaries. We had been using Ant-Ivy before and moved a lot of files from Ivy, from our Subversion repository at the time that Ivy and Ant drew on. So some of those we put in at the beginning, and then as more development happens, we've added more customized binaries. In some cases, due to our National Cancer Institute security profile and other reasons, we have some customized binaries of open source jars and so on. So in some cases, we've run scripts to upload a bunch of things bulk. We've also done one-off manual uploads, and I'm happy that the uploading ability has kind of been added back in Nexus 3x. So anyway, I'll move on. So we also, some of our applications that we build, for some of them, we publish those binaries to Nexus. So we have it set up for some projects. We work with projects to make sure they understand how to set things up in their XML files so that they can enable automatic publications from builds. That is not the majority of our applications, but we do have that for some. Also, this 2x instance is where we migrated the repositories from Mayo Clinic, which had their own instance of Nexus Repository Manager. We work with Mayo Clinic on some of our applications, and they decided to shut their repository manager down, but we were able to take on all of their binaries to ensure that what we were building is still available to be built. And all right. So for 3x, we are doing some work with 3x and expect to be doing more as we go along. We have a 3x Docker instance that is used for some projects. We are expecting use of that instance to increase a lot more because we are doing more with Docker. We also have a 3x raw images instance. And then we also did a sort of a prototype with the Git LFS format. So I mentioned SVN before. We did an SVN to Git migration on GitHub. There were a number of large files that had been being stored in Subversion, which we didn't migrate them. We ended up not migrating them to Git. We archived them because they were mainly for some inactive projects. However, this kind of alerted us that we ought to be ready in case we needed to be able to support large format, large files. So we set up a Nexus instance strictly for Git LFS storage, and the way that works is with, the Git file has a pointer to the file in Nexus. So we're ready for that if applications demonstrate a need for that. So right now, these are all separate instances, and I'll talk on my future slide about what we may be doing going forward for consolidation. So integration into the workflow, most of our applications use Maven or Apache Ant. That is changing. We're starting to use some more technologies, but for Maven and for Ant build scripts, we provide XML templates and a settings XML file, which points to our Nexus 2x instance for dependencies. And so that is trying to ensure that our applications will be built pointing to our Nexus instance, which we know will be up, etc. We know how it's backed up. We know what it has cached, etc. We do have a little bit of NPM, and we're working with some other newer technologies as well, and we'll be figuring out what we can do to capitalize and leverage for that. So this is just an example of one of the build XML files. You see it's on GitHub. You can actually go and look at our URI resolver project and look at the POM XML. The settings XML is not in public view, but you can look at how that has things set up for referring to the builds. Let's see. So for continuous integration, so most of our active projects are on or migrating to Jenkins. We're using open source Jenkins. We don't have a lot of direct tie to Jenkins, but of course our builds use Jenkins. I'm sorry, we don't have a lot of direct ties between Jenkins and Nexus, although we will be looking more at that. But obviously our build scripts that are run on Jenkins refer to our Nexus repository manager instance. We do also have some legacy tooling. We're migrating everything off of Anthill Pro since it's been end of lifed by IBM. We've done some experiments with Travis CI and expect to try other tools. But for right now, it's Jenkins is where we're putting the bulk of our automation. So for packaging, I mentioned all the many containers and so on that we have. So our build artifacts might be zips, wars, ears, or Docker images. So the release packages currently are primarily stored on Jenkins. That may change. We do have some applications that publish directly to Nexus. Some of them are using the Maven release plugin to do that. Some of our applications have other NCI applications depending on them, and we've found it easier to have them in Nexus to be pulled for those applications. And then, as I mentioned, we're also doing some image storing of Nexus Docker, and I'm going to be talking more about that when I talk about some of our security stuff. So for our deploys, our standard tiers include dev, QA, stage, and production. That's not the only tiers we have. As I mentioned, some projects have special tiers, for instance, for data curation versus feature testing. And so we promote up the tiers to production. Here is a picture of our 2x instance. This shows our structure where we have right now the picture has the third-party files that are locally hosted highlighted, but above that you can see that we do have groups for QA releases, stage releases, dev releases, etc. And CBIT hosted, again, I mentioned the organization we primarily support is CBIT under National Cancer Institute. So this is just to give you an idea of some of our use. All right, so integration with other tools. So we are using Twistlock for Docker image scanning, and that is very tightly related to our Nexus 3x Docker image repository. Again, in my all-day DevOps presentation, I talked more about how connected we are with the other parts of the organization, the security team, et cetera, the developers and all that. So security is very much on our mind. For Docker, what we have set up is we're using a commercial tool called Twistlock. So it's used actually in 3 different places related to our Docker images. One is we're using Jenkins to build the Docker images. To do that, we refer to Twistlock to do a scan of the image before we actually publish that to the Nexus 3x Docker image repository. So that's during the build. And then once it's in that repository, well, security vulnerabilities, new ones are discovered every day. So we keep scanning the Nexus Docker image repository because we know that new vulnerabilities might show up in files that are already in that repository. And then just before we would deploy to any new tier, we'd perform another scan just to make sure nothing has popped up since the last time we did our regular scans of the image repository. So we have found a number of benefits of using Nexus. I didn't go into our whole evaluation process where we decided to choose Nexus over some of the other options, but what we wanted to do was simplify the maintenance of the internal artifact repositories and the access to the external artifact repositories. So you saw that the GitHub files are in, you saw our source code for many of our projects is in GitHub, and our Nexus instance, the 2x instance, is currently public facing to allow for community engagement of, say, universities that want to download National Cancer Institute code and try and build it. So our artifact repositories that some of those builds refer to are public, and it was simpler to do that with Nexus. We also are hosting other types of artifacts, not just those generated by Maven. We are doing some looking into more use of the raw images, and I was interested to hear the discussion earlier today about the blob capability for cloud storage. Anyway, benefits. So we're able to do the proxies for requests for external artifacts and cache the results. So once we've built something, we have build resilience to be able to build it again. That's not perfect, but as with security, perfect build reproducibility, there are trade-offs. You have to decide what level you're trying to ensure. So also benefits, it provides a deployment destination for NCI-generated artifacts, release packages, and so on. All right, so for the future, we are planning to migrate our 2x instance to a 3x instance later on this year. We have been trying to do that. It got pushed back a little from when we thought we'd do it, but I think we are going to be able to start tackling it pretty aggressively this month and next month. We are planning. We know there will be more use of Docker among NCI application projects. We need to improve our Docker instance management, and we also expect to see more orchestration, automation, and how much we start leveraging Nexus even more than that, we are going to be looking into. I know that we have openings to leverage it more. We're also going to look at consolidating the artifact locations even more than we have them right now. You saw that we have multiple Nexus instances. We know we're not going to combine the main Maven 2 instance with the Docker image repository, even though they'll both be 3x instances later this year, just for performance reasons. So we have to look at the trade-offs for the consolidation of, we want things simple, but we also want to ensure that we have the right balance for performance, etc. So integration with workflow tools. One of the previous speakers was talking about Jira use. We are not sure to what extent we're going to do that, but we have a fair bit of use of Jira and ServiceNow, depending on which team you're working with. Also, so I've been mainly talking about application build and deployment, automation, etc. We are using Puppet. We are doing some Ansible, and we may be able to work on instances, on further leveraging of Nexus with that. We're also hoping to do more security improvements. I would love for us to be doing scanning of dependency artifacts before building, and more integration on automation related to security profiles. There we go. Somehow I skipped past. Okay, I skipped past my line where I was talking about that we are doing more NPM. We've had Yum for quite a while. Right now, we have Yum, our Yum repository stored another way. We may look at using Nexus for Yum management in the future, and NPM as well. We don't have heavy use of it at NCI, but we might be able to leverage Nexus for that as well. Let's see, I want to thank some of my teammates, Phil Hartman and Srini Gadila and Robert Zhang, that I talked with to make sure I was all the most current. The Nexus stuff I've done is most with the 2x, but I did want to be able to talk about the 3x that we are doing more and more of. So I will be going on to the Slack channel, and you can also look for me on Twitter at Configures, or search my name. And I'm going to minimize this and just make sure that y'all are still hearing me. Can someone say something?
You're
okay.
doing great.
Okay, so
I'll
share the thing again. But Mark, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a question for you. Curious, and I really don't know the answer here. When you did the migration of Nexus from different sources, like I think you said you had integration with the Mayo Clinic that you brought it in,
Yes.
imported in. How was that process?
Well, we did end up talking a fair bit with Sonatype support to try and make that go the best we could. Let me just think a minute. I could definitely follow up in the Slack channel in a few minutes on that, but I just want to remember for sure we tried a few different ways. We ended up getting large files from them and unrolling them on the new on our Nexus instance, and then we had to go in and set up pointers and permissions. So it was kind of a brute force approach. We had been for years just proxying their repository, but when they were going to shut it down, we had to kind of react in a hurry. So we ended up taking a pretty brute force approach of taking the files. They made very large tar files, and then we got them and unrolled them in the location that we had discussed with the Sonatype support people, and set up the connection points, set them up in the repositories and groups again, so that they could be accessed as though they had been there all along, and so that our builds could still. We had to do some tweaking with we didn't actually have to change the builds, but we had to change some of the access and group configurations, as I recall. But I'd be happy to talk about that more in detail. That's about all I can say offhand. It was a while ago.
Well, thank you. We look forward to seeing you in the Slack channel. For those of you that have questions for Sarah, she is headed for the Slack channel. And
okay.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Sure.